Okay, guys. Sorry I missed you today. Long story, but at any rate, I didn't want you guys to lose out on the lesson today, and I do want to still try to get this unit in before Thanksgiving break. So let's go ahead and move on. So in the beginning of this unit, we've been talking about different kinds of markets. And the first unit we did, of course, was perfectly competitive markets. And we learned a lot about why we love perfectly competitive markets. The reason really is because in the end, they keep everyone happy. They keep the producers producing at profit maximizing levels while at the same time keeping prices nice and low for consumers. So if we're going to look at what we really like, it probably also makes sense to go and look at the other extreme next. And that's going to be Unit 7 here, monopolies. And today I just want to get you warmed up and introduced a little bit to this topic. So let's go ahead and get started. I think when everybody thinks of a monopoly and they hear the word monopoly, they kind of have a negative impression to begin with. And that's with good cause. Economists generally don't really like monopolies. And we'll kind of get into why. And this cartoon actually that you see here is a famous one from back during the 1920s when monopolies really had a pretty bad reputation. And you can see that it just sort of looks like a big, fat, bloated money bag. And that's really what monopolies sometimes can be. So first, let's define what they are. What is a monopoly actually? A monopoly is when there is only one firm in the industry. Right? When essentially, whereas in a PCM there had to be many, many firms producing in the industry, a monopoly is the exact opposite. There is only one firm in the industry. But that alone isn't enough. There are some cases when there is only one firm, and we still really wouldn't call it a monopoly, because the other side of the coin is that it has to be such that it is not possible for other people to come into the market. So it's fine and good if you're the only gas station in town. As long as there was the option for someone else to come in, then you really wouldn't be a monopoly, even if you were the only one there. It has to also be true that it's very difficult for other firms to enter the market. Now, there are lots of reasons why it might be difficult for a firm to enter the market. And those different reasons are really what explain how we get different kinds of monopolies and why monopolies exist at all. So again, just to summarize this slide, a monopoly really is, first of all, A, when there is only one firm in the industry, and B, it is impossible for other firms to come into the market. That makes a monopoly a monopoly. By the way, that third category of homogeneous versus heterogeneous products, well, in this case, it doesn't really matter because there's only going to be one product, the product produced by the one firm. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. I want to talk about different types of monopolies. And number two, I want to talk about the kinds that exist. There are a number of different kinds. And you'll see why I have a picture of diamonds there in a second. The first is what's called a resource monopoly. Now, resource monopolies are not all that common, but they're worth mentioning. Resource monopolies are essentially a monopoly that exists because someone has exclusive ownership of a particular resource. And I'm sorry for the typos. I'm trying to make this kind of quickly this morning. It's a monopoly that exists because someone has exclusive ownership of a particular resource. So, for example, a really simple example might be if you own the only lake for a 100-mile area, and people who wanted to go fishing pretty much were stuck going to your lake. That's why the monopoly exists there. It's not because someone doesn't want to compete with you, but there's no way for them to compete with you. You own the only lake. You own the only resource, and therefore you're going to be the only one that produces it. One of the more famous examples that is a little bit more on a large scale is actually the jewelry grade diamond industry. For many, 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 many years, a company known as De Beers, and it still is known as De Beers, was pretty much the exclusive owner of the diamond mines in South Africa, where so many of the jewelry grade diamonds come from in the world. And as long as De Beers owned those diamonds, all those companies that would buy, whether it's K Jewelers or whoever it might be, all of those companies had to buy their diamonds from De Beers, and that gave De Beers a monopoly. Now, we're going to get into the details tomorrow, but you can kind of already get a feeling for why that might not be a good thing for a market, why economists get a little sketched out by monopolies. But one reason it happens is because of what we call resource monopolizing, when you only have a resource and you're the only one who owns it. Okay. A second kind of monopoly, and it's a little confusing because it's similar to a resource monopoly, but actually it's different, is what's called a natural monopoly. And a natural monopoly is a monopoly that exists because it would be impractical or not cost effective to have more than one producer. So in other words, there are instances when we really need to have monopolies because doing it any other way would be really not a good move. No company could do it. So for example, think of Orange and Rockland. Orange and Rockland provides a number of things. One of the things it provides is natural gas to much of Spring Valley. Now, natural gas comes to your house in pipelines that are buried underground, under roads, under parks, wherever, and eventually enter your house at one point and then feed your house with gas. Well, the cost of putting those pipes in, the cost of setting up that company is so huge that there really is no way that Orange and Rockland or any other company could survive if they had someone else doing the exact same thing. In other words, suppose another company came in and said, okay, I want to compete with Orange and Rockland, so I'm going to build a whole new set of pipes to everyone's houses in the entire neighborhood. Well, never mind all the construction problems that would cause and all the issues it would cause with tearing up roads and digging in people's yards. The reality is that probably neither company could survive if that was the case. So the only reason that we can get gas, water, and electric delivered to our house is because only one company does it. I suppose it might be nice to be able to go to your sink and choose which water provider you're gonna take from, but that's not a practical option. Okay. Another good example is the Bear Mountain Bridge. The Bear Mountain Bridge is owned by, actually not sure who it's owned by. I think it's owned by the Port Authority. But anyway, whoever owns the Bear Mountain Bridge, they own a monopoly on that Bear Mountain Bridge because the reality is you are not going to build two bridges right next to each other. That would be impractical to do cost-wise. Neither bridge could be afforded if you did that. So you have to have one bridge. Now, one thing we're going to learn about these companies, Orange and Rockland and the Bear Mountain Bridge, things like that tend to be very closely watched by the government because they're monopolies that sort of have to exist, but again, they're monopolies, so we want to watch how they behave. We'll talk a little more about that later in the lesson. By the way, think about this maybe as sort of a bonus question. What is the thing that these companies seem to share in common that make them natural monopolies? And I'll give you a hint, it has to do with their fixed costs. Okay? So two kinds of monopolies we've looked at so far, resource monopolies and natural monopolies. Oh, yeah, I mentioned an example is your water company. Okay. A third kind of monopoly is what we call a government-created monopoly, or sometimes we just call it a government monopoly. And that's very simply a monopoly that exists because the government has created it. Now, sometimes the government actually just goes ahead and owns it, like it does with the U.S. Postal Service. That's a monopoly. The government decided that the mail service 200 years ago was so important that ultimately the government needed to own and control that, and that there really couldn't be competition. Governments make those decisions sometimes where they say it is in everyone's best interest that there not be competition. That's becoming more and more rare today. However, one big exception to that rule is an example of where we really do need a monopoly, and that is the issue of patents and copyrights. Now, if you're not familiar with what those are, patents and copyrights are essentially documents that give people legal protection over something they've created. Copyrights are for ideas like books or pieces of music or stories or ideas, and patents are for inventions, actual physical things. The government often gives out special permission to companies. For example, just recently there was a vaccine being created for the Ebola virus, which obviously has been in the news. The company that's producing that vaccine has a patent on that vaccine, which gives them the exclusive right to make that vaccine for, I believe it's up to right now, I want to say it's close to 10 years. I have to look up the numbers, but The question you want to ask yourself is, why would the government want to do that? And think about that just a little bit if you could. Why would the government want a situation where people or companies can create something and then essentially create a monopoly, right? They're the only ones that can sell that thing going forward. Why would the government allow and in fact encourage that to happen if we kind of get the sense that monopolies are not a great thing? So think about that a little bit, maybe as kind of a thought as we go through. But these are another examples of monopolies. Okay, one last little bullet point here. I want to mention a term called antitrust regulation. The term trust and the term monopoly have become synonymous. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but for our purposes they do. And so an antitrust law or an antitrust regulation is a regulation that's meant to prevent monopolies. The most famous of which is called the Sherman Antitrust Law, and I'm sure in American history last year you guys learned about that. Generally speaking, we try to avoid the existence of monopolies. We generally tend to think of monopolies as not being such a great thing. And in fact, so much so that we often make them illegal. And I'm going to actually show you, if we have time here, a brief video in a second of the very famous Microsoft case from 2000, where Microsoft was charged with being a monopoly and doing monopoly-ish things to keep other companies from competing against them. And by a law, that is illegal in American business. There are probably better ways to deal with monopolies, and we'll talk about that in this unit. But currently, simply being in a monopoly is generally, unless you have a special permission, generally considered illegal. And that's through these antitrust laws. Okay, I'm going to finish with this video here, though I'm realizing it's going to be easier for me to send this as a separate link. So I'll do that now. If throughout the course of watching that video you want to take any notes, that's fine. And hopefully I'll see you guys tomorrow.